instrumentalized by those who want to defend everything Israel does. It can become politically instrumentalized by those who want to criticize everything that Israel does. I mean, I think we need to separate the question of what kind of extraordinary, monstrous, traumatic, historical genocide that was from the question of how best to legitimate state. And what I like about Zertal is that she actually objects to the instrumentalization of the Holocaust because she thinks it needs to be mourned in its own right, and that if it gets instrumentalized for contemporary political reasons, it actually is defiled.
Where's there like a space for that? Like it seems so difficult to.
One must insist on both.
Yeah.
One must insist on both.
Both the political and.
I think on the absolute hideousness of the Nazi genocide, a continuing, making clear of that historical record, a continuing commemoration, a continuing marking. At the same time, let that be separate from the question of what is happening now. I mean, and what ought to happen now, like what best polity ought there to be. And as they get forged, as they get linked again and again, it becomes almost impossible to take a position, because if you object to something that Israel does, or you hope for a more peaceful mode of cohabitation for the people of those lands, you actually get accused of being insensitive to the Holocaust, as if sensitivity to the Holocaust implies the subscription to a particular version of Zionism. I don't think it's true. I think if we can sever those issues, we actually can open up, and it's also hideous to hear, the anti-Semitic vitriol against the Holocaust, right? Like, the Holocaust is nothing but a Jewish excuse to oppress others. Like, no, absolutely not. Right? I mean, that has to be objected to as strenuously as anything else. And it's too bad that Arendt didn't make room for mourning. Because if she had shown that sensibility, if she had understood that, then she would have been able to make her arguments in a different way, and people would have maybe trusted where she was coming from. It's why Primo Levi, I think, is really quite stunning in this way. I mean, he did nothing but tell the stories of various people in those concentration camps and tried to give face and name and anecdote to everything that happened there as an honest chronicler and as a public act of mourning and as a public act of resistance to what happened. And at the same time, he actually thought it was on the basis of his experience there that he needed to object to state violence done against dispossessed people. Right? It was on the, he said, no, you're reading the wrong lesson from the Holocaust. The lesson from the Holocaust is we have to oppose statelessness. We have to oppose state violence. We have to oppose nationalism. Right? I mean, that's the lesson. That's what is implied. So, it's very, very hard. Yeah. And, getting people to listen to both, to hold both things at once, not easy. Not easy. But absolutely imperative. Okay. I don't know if we can make this particular switch, but let me just say this about my work on gender, why it's conceivable that someone who works on gender in this way might also think about Middle East politics in this way. When I worked Gender Trouble, I was particularly concerned with who counts as real, or how people get established as having recognizable genders, or genders that count as real. And, one of the points I wanted to make there was that those who are considered unreal, or shadows of the real, or poor imitations of the real, actually give us a chance to understand how the reality of gender is produced and reproduced over time and through certain kinds of stagings, and that it can be produced and reproduced in different kinds of ways, that we shouldn't assume that there's a given, natural, physical gender. There may well be a kind of problematic of sex upon which gender functions, But I would disagree with Arendt here to say I am a woman as part of my physicality. I don't think so. But how those kinds of gender realities get established over time has everything to do with thinking about how ontology, right, the status of being, who exists, who can be recognized as having being, alters according to the norms that govern our capacity for recognition, right? So, in a way, you could say that the Hegelian problematic of recognition is in all of these problems, or the question of whose lives count, or who can be recognized as real. These are questions that I pose again and again. I think I was posing it in Gender Trouble, and I think I was posing it in Precarious Life, and I don't think that in that sense there is that huge of a discrepancy. It's just that the focus in some sense changes. And I think, in fact, if you consider, and there are institutions of power that do recreate what counts as a citizen, what counts as a recognizable life, what counts as a mournable life. And indeed, the question of whose life is grievable was one that emerged for me in the context of the U.S. AIDS crisis. We know that there's still, of course, global AIDS crisis, and within a certain class strata in the U.S. there continues to be AIDS crisis. But I think at the point where it became, a question of activism on the part of ACT UP and Queer Nation to make visible the losses from AIDS, it was also a question of trying to make certain kinds of lives and loves recognizable or visible within public space. And this seemed like a very important thing to do. I thought the Names Project, as old as it is now, was a very important effort precisely because it was open public mourning. It was open public mourning of lost lives, which otherwise would have been silently passed over because they were considered shameful, either because of sexual practice or perceived sexual identity or drug practice or something like that. So public mourning struck me as extremely important as a way of undoing shame, and it also struck me as an extremely important political problem, and it led me to consider, okay, are there grievable lives? What counts as a grievable life? What's an ungrievable life? What kinds of lives are not marked as grievable? I think after 9/11 that came up in another way when U.S. lives destroyed on 9/11 were openly and dramatically mourned. At least legal workers were. The legal workers were not. And commemorated in very certain ways through obituary practices. And yet we entered into wars in which we were slaughtering lives and we had no idea what those names were, what those faces were. There was no commemoration, there was no obituary. Right? So who gets an obituary and who does not? And why does the national press only mourn its own? And what would it mean for us to even attempt to mourn those in whose that the U.S. has destroyed when we don't have a kind of language or media that actually makes something of those lives available. Now, I think there is something called a kind of unequal distribution of grievability. Right? We're used to thinking about unequal distribution of food. Or we can think about unequal distribution of recognition, which is part of what I'm talking about, but unequal distribution of grievability. Some people are more grievable than others. And it has to do with which lives count as lives and which lives do not count as lives. And I think there are gradations, and I think that this can shift historically depending on what kinds of dominant framings happen within immediate politics.